We have to consume a lot of stuff. We have to consume proteins. We have to consume a lot of things that we can't make on our own, that we have to eat something that made it. Vitamin C, we can't make vitamin C. We have to eat something that has vitamin C in it. But plants, if they need it, they can make it. If they need it, they can make it. And all plants use the same essential elements. All plants use nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, manganese, boron, all of them. So the idea that has been imprinted in our minds that when we fertilize plants, we're actually feeding them food is incredibly incorrect. And it's not so bad that it's incorrect. The worst thing is that it's misleading. People literally believe they are giving their plants food when they fertilize them, just like they're giving their dog food when they put a can of dog food in the bowl. And nothing could be different, more different. We're not feeding plants by any stretch of the imagination. We're just giving them some minerals. So if your dog had to have a calcium supplement and you had to stuff a pill down his throat once a day, that's fertilizing. That's not feeding. That's not feeding. So is everybody okay on this? It's a mental shift. I don't know how far you had to shift. Each person has to shift on their own. But you have to shift your mind away from how we live and understand how they live. It's a very different way of living altogether. So this is what they absorb to build their bodies, and this is what they make with it. Now, when this sugar molecule is broken down, when it's oxidized, it releases the energy that it contains, and the plant can then use that energy to run its life processes. When we eat plants that have sugar in them, the sugar that we ingest contains the energy of the sun stored. And when our bodies break those chemical bonds and release that energy, we're releasing the energy of sunlight for our bodies to utilize that was stored by the plant that we're eating. When we eat an animal, like a cow, that ate the grass, that stored the energy of the sun, we're still getting the energy from that meat, from the sun ultimately. So in a way, we're solar powered because all of the food that we eat is based on the energy captured by plants, the light energy captured by plants. Are y'all all focusing down on that some? So as gardeners, you can't feed your plants. There is no such thing as plant food. There is fertilizer. So as a favor to me, I'd like you to remove the terms plant food and feed from your vocabulary as I'm teaching you terms and substitute fertilizer and fertilize, because feeding and food completely misrepresents what we're actually doing and leads to more confusion than help. All right, so that's photosynthesis. This is the basis of life as we know it, this chemical reaction. Environmental factors affecting plant growth. And I'm going to kind of go over a few notes I have here, and then we're going to look at a PowerPoint program on this called Maximizing Gardening Success. Isn't that a great title? Wouldn't you watch that? So we'll be watching that, Maximizing Gardening Success. All right, environmental factors affecting plant growth, light. So now you begin to understand the relationship plants have with light. We say, oh, well, this plant prefers this light exposure, or this plant likes shade, or this plant likes sun, as if it's a preference. Likes. Well, you know, I like it, you know, when it's sunny, but I don't die when it's rainy. So preferences are, light is not a preference for plants. Remember, light is their sustenance. When we talk about giving plants the right light, it's like talking about feeding your new baby the right food. It's no different. So for plants, making sure they get enough light is how we make sure they get enough food. Making sure they get enough light is how we make sure they get enough food. If we don't give the plant the light preferences it needs, it may not be able to make enough food for itself. So it will starve. It will be hungry. And nothing else you do can compensate for that. Again, you cannot give the plant the food it needs. It has to manufacture it for itself. So let's take an example. If you have a plant that likes a sunny situation, we know it won't do very well in the shade. And if we have a plant that likes a shady situation, we know it won't do very well in the sun. But did you ever think of why? Why? Was there some committee that got together and decided, well, this is a sun-loving plant, this is a shade-loving plant? Now, these preferences, as we'll see in the slide program, come from their ancestors. So when we're looking at these plants, why does a plant that likes sun do poorly in the shade? Well, I have to tell you about my cousin Larry. My cousin Larry is this big, a little older than I am, and he's been this big his whole life. He eats candy bars all day, snacks on hamburgers, He must consume 5,000 to 6,000 calories easily in a day. He's never been any bigger than this. Larry is a sun-loving plant. He needs a high energy input, lots of calories to be happy and healthy. If he doesn't eat that much, he's miserable. He's miserable. He's hungry, he's grumpy. He has to consume those calories to be happy. So he's a sun-loving plant. He needs to be right out in the sun, getting high energy input. I'm a shade-loving plant. I have a very efficient metabolism. I could eat 1,000 calories a day maybe, and still probably put on a little weight here and there along the way. Shade-loving plants have efficient metabolisms. They're able to take the limited light resources of a shady area, the limited energy input from the shade, and still create adequate amounts of food for themselves to be healthy and grow properly. A sun-loving plant, like my cousin Larry, doesn't have that ability. If you put a sun-loving plant in the shade, it cannot manufacture enough food to keep itself healthy and happy. And that's why they do poorly. They won't bloom, they stretch, they drop leaves, they lose vigor. They're starving. Before your very eyes, they're starving in that shady location. Now, shade-loving plants like me, we should be able to thrive with 5,000 calories a day. If I took 5,000 calories a day and ate, each have to roll me around from program to program. So obviously it's not healthy for me to eat that much. Well, when we take a shade-loving plant and put it out in the sun, remember, shade-loving plants, their ancestors evolved in shady conditions. They never had to develop the protective pigments or chemicals in their tissue to make sure that they weren't going to be damaged by ultraviolet light. You know, ultraviolet light is highly toxic and damaging to life. Look what it does to us. Skin cancer, premature aging, it's horrible for living things. Plants are no different. Shade-loving plants have no defense against the ultraviolet light. And when we put that out in the sun, the ultraviolet light literally burns their tissues and makes them unhealthy. So we can't put sun-loving plants in the shade because they'll starve, and we can't put shade-loving plants in the sun because they'll burn. Now you know the reason why and the rest of the story. There are 3 aspects to light that you'll see there on page 13. When it comes to plants, quantity, and we'll talk about quantity in the slide program. Quantity is the calorie input. Quantity is how much energy they are absorbing in the course of the day. But there's also quality. And this is an interesting discussion. When you think about quality, great looking shirt right there. That shirt is aqua or turquoise because the dye that fabric was dyed with absorbs every wavelength of light except that particular shade of blue. It reflects that wavelength of light. The rest of them get absorbed, and that's why our eyes see that shirt as that color, because that's the color of light it's reflecting. That's why we see colors. When you see an object and you see the color, the object is not that color. The light it's reflecting is that color, and that's why you see that color. Now, you know, when we pass light through a prism, that we see that this white light that we think of as white is actually composed of many different wavelengths that our eyes perceive as colors. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet are the colors of the spectrum. So all of those colors are present in the light that's all around us. And when that light strikes a surface like your shirt, is dyed with a pigment that absorbs every color of light except that particular shade of green, and it reflects that color, and that's why that shirt looks green to us. Are you all understanding how we see color? And are you all wondering why I'm telling you how we see color? Well, it's interesting. Again, I like you have good conversations at your cocktail parties. So you can say, look at that bright red tomato. Do you know why that tomato looks red to us? So with plants, we know that plants are absorbing light energy, And we know that plants contain the pigment chlorophyll, and so plants look what color to us? Green. Plants are green because the pigment that they use to absorb light is green. Chlorophyll is green. That is, we see chlorophyll is green. And that means that when light strikes a plant's leaf, that leaf is not absorbing all of the wavelengths of light equally. That is, it's not just sucking in the red, the orange, the yellow, the green, the blue, the indigo, and the violet and using all of it the same. It's telling us that it's reflecting the green light. The green wavelengths are being reflected. That is, they're being thrown away. They're being sent out. They're not being absorbed into the process. They're being reflected from the leaf and rejected. So that tells us that the green part of the spectrum, the green light wavelengths, are not important to photosynthesis. That photosynthesis is mostly driven by the red end of the spectrum and the blue end of the spectrum, not the green. They're rejecting or reflecting the green. Is everybody with me on all this? That is the quality of the light. The balance of the wavelengths in the light is the quality. Now, sunlight is perfect. It has all the wavelengths plants need, and they grow beautifully in natural sunlight. But when we start growing plants under artificial light, or filtering the light in some way and affecting the balance of the wavelengths, then we have some issues. These fluorescent lights, for instance, are rich in blue light. That's what gives them that cool white color. They're rich in blue and not rich in red. So these lights have plenty of blue wavelengths for photosynthesis, but they don't have the red wavelengths. So if we're going to grow plants under artificial light, we try to get light bulbs or light fixtures that contain bulbs specifically designed to grow plants, because they've been constructed to emit the light frequencies that plants need most efficiently to photosynthesize. Y'all with me? So if you're going to grow plants under artificial light, the quality becomes important. You need to make sure that you choose light fixtures that provide the right balance. If you filter the light in some way, when I was a young agent, I had a long conversation with the guy that built a greenhouse. We could not figure out why his plants were not thriving. He'd had it for like 6 months. He said, nothing is doing well that I put in there. And I went over everything: air circulation, light, watering, diseases, insects. I said, I'm really at a loss. Where did this greenhouse come from? He said, oh, I made it myself. He said, I put the frame together with pressure-treated wood, and I decided to cover it with fiberglass. The odd thing is when I went to the building supply store to get the fiberglass, they had all these different kinds of fiberglass: pink and white and green and stripes and clear. And I just got totally confused until finally it dawned on me, I'm building a greenhouse. A greenhouse. And then it became not just apparent I needed green fiberglass. So he bought green fiberglass and sheathed his whole greenhouse with green fiberglass. And that fiberglass was filtering out all of the beneficial red and blue wavelengths that plants need for photosynthesis and letting through the inefficiently utilized green light wavelengths that plants don't use so well. And so they weren't able to make food for themselves properly. They couldn't photosynthesize properly in that green light, and so they weren't doing well. So that's where quality comes in. Quality. And duration. Duration is how many hours of light there are in a 24-hour period and how many hours of darkness there are in a 24-hour period. And remember earlier, I told you plants needed to know when the winter came to an end. And many plants do that by measuring how many hours of cold they experience, and they won't wake up and grow until they've experienced the average number of hours of cold that their winters usually have. Y'all with me on that? Well, plants are also able to measure the photo length, and that is they can measure how many hours of darkness there are in a 24-hour period. Many plants are able to do this. Why? Well, as we move into the fall of the year, plants have to get ready for the winter. In November, our temperatures down here are still in the 70s. At Christmas last year, it was 75 degrees. How do plants know it's winter? Even. And how do they know winter's coming, in particular when it's warm in October and very mild in November, and yet still the trees are dropping their leaves, as if they know winter's on its way, even though the weather is mild? The trees are measuring how many hours of darkness there are in a 24-hour period, and they can perceive the lengthening of the nights that occur in the fall. And when the length of the nights reaches a certain period, they know that winter is coming, and it sets off a bunch of triggers in them that leads to the dropping of their leaves, the storing of food, the movement of sap down into their roots, and all the things they do to get ready for winter. Again, plants are more aware of their surroundings than you may have given them credit for. Measuring the length of night to know what time of the year you're in is what we do. That's how we know what time of the year we're in. We know when there's the spring equinox is when we had equal night and darkness. Last month in June, we had our summer solstice, the longest day of light and the shortest period of darkness. We divide our year up by measuring the light versus the darkness, and these plants are able to do the same thing. Why do poinsettias bloom for Christmas and not the 4th of July? They're photoperiodic. They are only triggered to bloom when the nights are long. So in the summer, when the nights are short, no flowers. In the winter, when the nights are long, they come into bloom for us, as are chrysanthemums. And there are other plants that only do things when the nights are short. So again, many plants have the ability to do this. It helps guide them through the year to do the right thing at the right time, and it is called photoperiodism. Notice under temperature on page 13, there's some discussion there. Warm season and cool season, again, do keep those concepts in your mind. That's very important when it comes to our seasons. If we have time, I actually have a program on that if we have time. Heat. Remember, it is the heat of our climate that defines our plant palette. What trees, what lawn grasses, what shrubs, what perennials that we grow. It's not the cold of winter. We have very mild winters. If we didn't try to pretend we lived in the tropics sometimes, if we didn't try to pretend like we lived in Honolulu or Miami, where it never freezes, we would never have issues with hardiness. It's only when we decide to grow tropical plants, native to climates that don't have freezes, that we get into trouble. But all of our regular trees and shrubs and ground covers and vines, nobody loses trees to the cold. Nobody loses lawns to the cold. These plants are all perfectly hardy here. And it's the heat of our summer that defines that plant palette, not the cold of our winter. Hardiness versus tender, we've already discussed. So let's do a little review. If a plant is hardy, what does that mean? Raise your hand if you think you have a good concept. If a plant is hardy, what does it mean?
Tolerates cold, cooler temperatures.
Flesh it out. And it's important to flesh it out just a little bit. You can't just say cold. It's too ambiguous. What's cold? 32 degrees. So if it freezes at 32, it's tender. What if it freezes at 28?
It's hardier.
Yeah, but is it hardy? If it would die at 28 degrees in Baton Rouge, is it hardy here? No. Notice what I had to say. In Baton Rouge, hardiness and tenderness are very locale related. You can say something simple, and if you want to say a simple definition, hardy plants are plants that tolerate below freezing temperatures, and tender plants are plants that don't. But that is way too simplistic. So remember the definition I gave you. A hardy plant is a plant that reliably survives the winter where you garden with little or no protection. You don't have to look in a book. Talk to somebody that tried to grow it already. You know, if it can survive the winter where you are. Plants that are hardy in Baton Rouge will not necessarily be hardy in Shreveport, but they'll probably be hardy in Baker. You know, so the closer you are, the less difference it makes between. Tender is a plant that will not reliably survive the winter where you garden without extraordinary effort. So if a plant is tender, it will not reliably survive the winter where you garden. If the plant is hardy, it will reliably survive the winter where you garden. And that's why we oftentimes add something, hardy where you garden, or it's tender where you garden. Because the plant may be tender where you garden, but perfectly hardy further south. It's like, is wearing an overcoat making you more tolerant to the cold? Well, if you take that overcoat off and stand there without nothing on, you'd be pretty darn cold. So the overcoat doesn't make you any more tolerant to the cold, but when you put it on, it keeps you warmer. So you're no more tolerant to the cold, you're just protected from it. So when we mulch a plant, the mulch can protect whatever it covers, and only whatever it covers. So if you have mulch at the base of a plant, the only part it covers is whatever part you've covered with it, maybe that much of the lower part of the plant. It's not going to protect the upper part of the plant at all. You understand that? Okay. I have a whole program on protecting plants from cold during the winter. It's fascinating. All right. Let's see. We've got hardiness and heat zones. We'll cover that in a second. Wind chill. Do plants feel wind chill? No. They do not feel wind chill. Wind chill is what a warm-blooded mammal feels when the wind is removing the warmth that our bodies create, and it makes us feel colder than it actually is. Plants don't create any heat in their bodies. They are whatever temperature the air temperature is. So plants don't feel wind chill. If you're sitting watching the 10 o'clock news and they say tonight temperatures are going to get down to 34 degrees with a wind chill of 27, and you hear 27 degrees and you jump up in your robe and start running outside with a bunch of sheets, as many of us will do here in South Louisiana, you don't need to, because it's going to be 34 degrees. It's not going to be 27 degrees. It's going to be 34 degrees. So always look at the actual temperature when it comes to evaluating possible damage to plants from cold. Don't look at the wind chill. And water, towards the end there. When it comes to water, we make it a lot more difficult than it is. Y'all, we really do. We fret, we worry. And if we're going to make a mistake, we almost always make a mistake of watering too much rather than not watering enough. I mean, I tell nursery staff, I do nursery staff training sometimes, and I always tell the nursery staff, when somebody comes in with a plant and it looks like it's a water problem, never ask them, well, are you watering? I mean, they just spent money on the plant. They're not going to take it home, stick it in the ground, and walk away and ignore it. At least most people won't. They're probably going to try to water it. So I always say, how are you watering it? Because, you know, if you ask them if they're watering it and they're not, they're going to say they are anyway. Oh, yeah, I water it all the time. But if you say, how are you? Well, let's see. A few months ago, I think I put some water on it. And so, again, watering is very important, but we really make it far more difficult than it is. Watering a newly planted tree, you do have to use a special effort like I showed you earlier. But most of the time we can water with sprinklers, soaker hoses, drip irrigation. There are all different kind of ways we can irrigate thoroughly. Just remember, when you're irrigating, nature tends to, when nature is doing the job we want it to do, we get a good rain, saturates the soil down a number of inches and gives the plants a really good drink of water, and then it doesn't rain for a while. And then we get another really good rain a week or two later, and it saturates the soil. That's how plants like to grow. What would it be like if it rained for 20 minutes every day? Like some people put on their irrigation systems, 20 minutes every day. What if it rained for 20 minutes every day? How healthy would our landscapes be? Well, they'd be waterlogged. We'd have diseases all over because the foliage would stay wet all the time. So again, think about irrigation as working with nature, working with the way nature irrigates properly. So when you do irrigate deeply and thoroughly. After you've finished irrigating an area, go out with your garden trowel and dig down in the ground. Did you wet down a good 4 to 6 inches? Or did you just wet the upper inch of the soil, which doesn't really do all that much good? And if you dig down and see that you did a good job of irrigation, then you've got a good technique down. But if you dig down and see you've wet it maybe an inch deep, you need to leave your system on longer and not have it come on as often. So again, we're after thorough deep irrigations done occasionally as needed, not constant irrigation. Water is stored in the soil quite well, so we don't have to water every day, generally speaking, except containers. If you've got containers out right now, you may need to water them. Watering containers is also very easy. People oftentimes wonder about watering containers. First off, they wonder if the soil is dry enough. to really need to be irrigated. And there are probes available that do a very good job of assessing the moisture level of the soil, so you don't have to worry about it or wonder. There's no use wondering, is it wet or is it dry? Use a probe, see what the soil moisture level is. My favorite probe is located at the end of my arm, and I take this particular water probe and I stick it into the medium up to the second knuckle of the probe. Wiggle the probe slightly and then withdraw the probe from the media. If it's damp, don't water. If it's dry, water. Sometimes you can do a little extra thing and do this. This is often kind of neat. Just do this. That's another way of assessing the moisture level of the probe. If it feels damp to your thumb, don't water. If it feels dry to your thumb, water. Y'all, that's all it takes to determine if the soil is dry. We will stand on our front porch and look out over our landscape going, well, it's been dry for about a week or so. I wonder if I need to water. I wonder how dry the soil is. When all you have to do is walk out there with a trowel and dig in a couple places and see. We got eyes and we got fingers. It's not a mystery whether or not the soil is dry enough to need to be watered. Now, if you wait so long the plants wilt slightly, then you know they need to be watered. That's not the best way to determine when you need to be watering. But if you look out at a landscape that's perfectly happy, the grass is green, the shrubs look happy, and you're worried about watering, why? If everything looks perfectly natural and happy, if it was really thirsty, wouldn't it let you know? Haven't you seen plants let you know they're thirsty? So again, we may water more than we need to. We may water excessively. So be careful about watering. Remember, it's worse to water too much than it is to water too little. If you're not sure whether or not you need to water, don't. If you're not sure whether or not you need to water, don't. If the next day you get up and everything's wilted, remind yourself the next time you think you need to water, water. When we water plants in containers, we add enough water so that some comes out of the drainage holes. So in the landscape, we apply water slowly with sprinklers or soaker hoses until it penetrates down several inches into the soil. When we water containers, we add enough water so that it flows through the container and comes out the drainage holes. The reason we do this is to make sure that we have wet the entire root ball. If you pour water into a container and it disappears, how far did it go down? How much of the root ball did it really wet? Is the bottom still dry? So again, by adding enough water where it comes out the drainage holes, we know we have completely wet the root ball. Second, every time it rains outside, how do you think new oxygen gets into the soil? Well, when it rains, the water pushes the old oxygen deeper, the old atmosphere deeper, and as it drains through the soil, it pulls new atmosphere in behind it, refreshing and replenishing the oxygen in the soil. When you water a plant in a container, the water flows down through that potting mix, pushes all the old atmosphere out in front of it, and as it drains out, it pulls new atmosphere in behind it, recharging the soil with oxygen. So the watering, either rainfall or irrigation or watering containers, helps to recharge the oxygen level in soils as well. So irrigation also helps in that. One of our best defenses to prevent having to water so much is mulch. So if there's one technique that we can utilize that helps us to minimize watering in our landscape, don't forget mulching. It's not just a weed control or a visual benefit. It prevents water from evaporating from the soil surface, so we don't have to irrigate as often when the beds are mulched.